All right. Well, thank you all for joining us tonight for episode 2 of River Rising Solutions, the webcast. I'm Shannon Blankenship, Advocacy Director at St. John's Riverkeeper, and I am joined virtually by co-host Jimmy Orth, Executive Director. Tonight's webcast is a look into seawalls as a solution to address sea level rise. We will ask, can walls protect us here in the St. Johns River watershed? In episode 1 of the River Rising Solutions webcast, we look at how unique the St. Johns River is and how changes that we've made to the river in deepening it, straightening it, and channelizing it over the last 100 years has brought the Atlantic Ocean to Jacksonville's doorstep, exacerbating the impacts of sea level rise. Tonight, we will be joined by coastal engineer Eric Olsen to discuss, can a wall save us? We're going to look at sea level rise in the St. Johns, how seawalls work, and the cost of building a wall to keep water out. We will then be joined by our guest speaker, and then we'll open it up to you, the viewers, for questions and to continue the conversation. So to begin, Jimmy, will you step in and tell viewers about St. John's Riverkeeper and why climate change impacts related to rising waters matters to our work?
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully most of you are familiar with us, but if you're not, we are a nonprofit advocacy group for the St. Johns River, and our role is really as a watchdog. We are out there trying to investigate pollution problems, trying to hold polluters accountable, and also seeking solutions. We do a lot of work with advocating for solutions to the problems and policy changes that are necessary to protect the river. We also are really active in educating the public. We have a full-time education director who works in the public schools and also with homeschool groups. And we do a lot to raise awareness and engage our members and the public in trying to activate people, because one of the things, we'll never have enough staff to actually do this work alone, that we really rely on an activated and engaged constituency for the river. We actually are represent the entire length of the river. A lot of folks, kind of only associate us with Jacksonville because our home base is in Jacksonville. Represent the 310-mile length of the St. Johns, which is about 9,000 square miles, the watershed. So it's roughly 14% of the state of Florida. So it's a huge watershed, covers a lot of territory. And we try to work throughout that watershed with local citizens to address a lot of these problems. We also have a part-time advocacy person in DeLand. So we're trying, as we grow as an organization, we're trying to expand our staff upriver, because as you may know, hopefully you do, that the river flows north. It flows, it forms just roughly west of Vero Beach and flows for about 310 miles to the Atlantic Ocean. One of the things Shannon wanted me to bring up real quickly is what does climate change and sea level rise have to do with the St. Johns? I think one of the things that we have to realize is that as sea level rise occurs, we're seeing more saltwater intrusion into the river, which when we also dredge, it also increases water levels in the river and saltwater intrusion farther upstream. And that can have a really devastating impact on freshwater submerged aquatic vegetation and wetlands and trees along the banks, and which can cause a lot of erosion problems as well. So we lose a lot of important habitat and the filters that really filter out pollution from the St. Johns. Also, what happens is we see that when we have more storms and we see flooding from sea level rise, we also have problems with runoff of pollution. And so water can actually infiltrate our wastewater pipes. And what happens is that backs up and it can flood our streets. When we saw it in Hurricane Irma, in the wake of that storm, there was actually 28 million gallons of raw sewage that were spilled across the state of Florida. And so you can see it has a huge impact. But it also, with rising water tables, we see a huge impact to things like septic tanks. Septic tanks can't work and function like they're supposed to if the water table is too close to the septic tank and to the drain field. And so those actually back up and don't work effectively as well. And then of course, all the chemicals that go into it. I'll give you this one fact real quick and I'll turn it back over to you because I thought it was so interesting, Shannon. is there was a study done last year in the Chesapeake Bay area, and they were looking at actually sunny day flooding. So they're seeing, this isn't associated with storms, but this is just associated with sea level rise. They found in testing that one morning of tidal flooding poured nearly the entire annual EPA allocation of nitrogen runoff for the river, 1,941 pounds of nutrients into the Chesapeake Bay. And then 40 water samples that they took, only 3 of those were safe for swimming, for safe swimming standards for fecal coliform. So you can see the impact that this has on the St. John's, not only on the St. John's, but on human health and on our quality of life.
Well, thanks, Jimmy. I think in getting back to seawalls as a potential solution for some of these impacts, right now what we're seeing is that any city that is waterfront, and many cities are, they're looking at the ways that they can armor themselves against rising water and storm surge. In Florida, waterfront cities not only face the challenge of sea level rise, raising water levels from the ocean, but also water rising up from the ground. Solutions that work to protect us from storm surge that occurs during hurricanes and big storm events may actually inhibit the functionality of solutions that protect against sunny day and regular nuisance flooding. Armoring our shorelines by building new walls or enhancing the standards for currently existing seawalls to be larger and stronger is a solution the city of Jacksonville is currently analyzing. And further, it's a solution that other cities are already implementing. Officials in Charleston, South Carolina have endorsed a $2 billion plan to wall off historic downtown from rising seas and surging storms. The city's been flooded 3 times since 2015, filling streets, pooling on critical evacuation routes, disrupting business, and rushing into homes and storms, resulting in millions in damage. In Galveston, Texas, the Corps has proposed placing a Dutch-style surge gates to keep a wall of water from swamping dozens of oil refineries and storage facilities, and the costs range from $2 to $37 billion. And Hurricane Sandy impacted New Jersey. The Corps is proposing a mixture of storm surge gates, barriers, levees, restored wetlands, home buyouts, and elevations, and costs for that project range up to $15 billion. Now, these solutions are expensive, and it's important that cities get this right, because often if you have a solution this expensive, it can be the only solution that you're able to have. Jimmy, I want you to chime in here on how armoring continues to be a conversation topic among other cities, but it's especially happening right here in Jacksonville now.
Well, I think that's the reason we wanted to do this, this topic on will the wall save us? You know, will it protect the city of Jacksonville and the communities along the St. Johns River? Is because that's one of the primary solutions that we hear offered to protect us from sea level rise. We've heard it over and over. You know, a lot of the leaders in government are talking about building seawalls, raising the bulkheads. And we've also heard a lot of people when we did our River Rising town hall meetings. That was something that they asked about frequently. So what we thought is, let's bring in the expert locally on this topic, Eric Olsen, and he can help us better understand what the pros and cons are of this and what some of the challenges are. Because that's the thing I think that's important for us all to remember is this is not simple to fix these problems. And it's going to take a lot of money, as Shannon just mentioned, and it's going to take some really complex solutions to protect us in the long run. So without further ado, let me introduce Eric Olsen. Eric is, he's the principal engineer at Olsen and Associates. And Eric has extensive experience in design and implementation of coastal protective structures, flood insurance studies, navigation projects, and impact assessment of coastal development. He really is one of the foremost experts in our region regarding the topic that we're going to discuss tonight. Eric also most recently was a member of the Adaptation Area Action Working Group. He was nominated to that group, and the group was established in Jacksonville to review the city's existing policies and programs regarding coastal flooding and to make policy recommendations to the city council. And one thing I want to make clear too, before I turn it over to Eric is that when we keep saying coastal flooding, because the St. Johns is an estuary and flows into the ocean. We're also talking about flooding regarding the St. Johns. So we're not just talking about along the beaches. We're talking about flooding along the St. Johns River and its tributaries as well. So Eric, why don't we'll kick it over to you and continue the discussion about sea level rise.
Okay, thanks, Jimmy. Our firm has enjoyed working with Riverkeeper for a number of years and also consulting to Nate Monroe and Chris Hong down at the newspaper to try to give them some facts. First and foremost fact is sea level rising in Jacksonville? And indeed it is. We've known historically, ever since I was a graduate student many years ago, sea level was rising. The rule of thumb, or the cocktail number that's been used historically for most of the East Coast, and it applies to certainly to Jacksonville, is about a foot per century. Jacksonville is lucky enough to have one of the tide gauges on the East Coast where data has been acquired back to about 1929. And that's what you see on the screen here. So if you take a fit of this curve, and you notice here, these are the mean water levels each year. Notice the scatter in this data. It's tremendous. It's up to half a foot or more sometimes. But what we've done historically is just run a regression line through that, and we've found that historically, through the entire period of record, the rate of sea level rise is about 0.87 feet per century. And that's where we get our nominal foot per century. Well, many communities and counties, particularly on the East Coast of Florida, that we consult to, have been noticing in the last few years and complaining that we're having more and more high waters, just like the high waters that Charleston experienced since 2015. What's going on here? Is this an acceleration of sea level rise having to do with climate or some other factors? Climate being the obvious target and subject of conversation for the last decade. Well, I don't know if you can see it here, but if you analyze the last 20 years of this curve, which is more modern, let's say from 2000 to 2020, the rate of sea level rise is 2 feet per century. So that's a pretty large increase from what we've experienced, or at least what we knew as common knowledge. What's a little bit scary with this, however, is that we recently, as of last week, we also analyzed not only the 20-year period, but the 15-year period and the last 10 years. If you look at the 15-year period, the rate of sea level rise is 2.64 feet per century. If you look at only the last 10 years of data, and again, that's kind of a dangerous thing, it's 3.74 feet per century, which is 4 times the number that we've been dealing with historically. Now, it's, technically, you generally don't look at such short periods of record, but a 20-year period of record is pretty realistic. So not only do we have an increase, but we may be ever increasing here, and we probably will not know what the number is until we acquire, let's say, the next 5 years worth of data as to what our rate of sea level rise is going to be in the St. Johns River.
I wanted to share this. It's just an image of the mouth of the river to kind of show what it looks like right now. And I think it has a lot to do with where these measurements were taken and, what we're really looking at our mouth. Eric, I brought up the example of Charleston and the fortress approach that they're taking. And I wanted to find out from you, because we've heard it mentioned, but is that fortress approach of Charleston something that you could see Jacksonville doing? Maybe you can compare the cities or contrast if that's fair.
Yeah, that's a logical question. And of course, the other study that's recently come out is the city of Miami, where they're looking at a similar approach to protect downtown Miami per se, the more developed portions of it. What you have to, of course, each one of these sites is different, and we're dramatically different. For example, at least with respect to where the city core is located. The bulk of our downtown area in Jacksonville is a multiple of miles up the river. and it is not as close to the ocean as both Charleston is and downtown Biscayne Bay. They're both very exposed to hurricane conditions. Matter of fact, if you look at the FEMA numbers for downtown Jacksonville, the theoretical 100-year storm is about 4 feet, NEVD data. When you look at Charleston and you look at Miami, you're dealing with 10 and 12 feet. So there are multiple, they have a multiple of risk greater than we do here with respect to storm surge. And for that reason that we would probably take a longer pause here in this area to look at the propriety of large-scale solutions like that. But it's, there are a number of fundamental questions that need to be answered when you look at building a wall which is a barrier, because it does not solve drainage problems that exist in the upland having to do with the rising waters that diminish the capacity of your drainage systems, most of which were designed, let's say, in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s in a lot of Jacksonville, say San Marco, Avondale, Riverside, Ortega. So it doesn't solve those problems. Matter of fact, if you read these stories, you'll see these reports, you'll see that the Corps only has authorization to protect from storm surge impact. They do not have authorization to resolve other problems. Those other problems have to be resolved by those communities. Now, Charleston's kind of unique in that you're only dealing with 8 miles of shoreline. All of it has a battery, so it's had a historical wall to begin with. It's not in somebody's front yard. And so at that location, it's relatively meaningful. It's awfully hard to envision building seawalls in the city of Jacksonville in front of residential properties, because it defeats the whole premise of living on the waterfront. I do not believe that the vast majority of homeowners would ever subscribe to it or allow it to be done, because nobody wants to sit in their dining room and look at a wall rather than the St. Johns River. Do away with your dock. Probably introduce a public facility in front of your property. So there are a lot of institutional problems when you begin to apply this to residential areas. Now, there are areas in Jacksonville, probably downtown, North Bank and South Bank, where additional walling, which has to be continuous, you can't have any outs in it, and it basically has to either inscribe the area or it has to tie back into elevations whereby flooding does not occur around the wall. Of course, in Charleston, they're literally taking that entire island and building 8 miles of wall to inscribe the entire area. We have areas like the stadium, Lot J. If we have 3 feet of sea level rise, those areas are going to be highly prone to flooding on a relatively high frequency basis, mostly due to lack of ability to drain. And it could be that those are the type of areas that we look at some type of ulterior armoring or seawalling or specialized protection. Of course, we have a number of hospitals and important infrastructure on the South Bank. The question is, how do you protect that with 3 feet of sea level rise? And again, is the government going to do it? Are the hospitals going to do it? Are the developers going to do it? And all of this leads up to some of the questions we're going to address at the end as to what the priorities of the city should be with respect to addressing sea level rise.
Eric, I wanted to jump in real quick because something you were talking about made me really think about, what Charleston is trying to do. I mean, there's obviously some downsides to that as well, and that we'll get into in a minute. But it's also, you look at it, in some ways, I think Jacksonville is much more challenging, as you just mentioned, to solve the problem of the seawall. And I know this is a very simplistic study, but there was a study that was done last year by the Center for Climate Integrity, excuse me, and they looked at how much it would cost for cities across the United States to be prepared for sea level rise by 2040. And they said they estimated $416 billion, with Florida being the most expensive at $76 billion, and Jacksonville being the most expensive city in Florida at $3.5 billion. And what they did is they calculated that it would be about 632 miles of seawall. And I think that's the thing people need to realize, is that we have so much shoreline that if you were just to try to wall us in, so to speak, it would be extremely challenging and extremely expensive, of course. So I just wanted you to address some of those challenges that we are dealing with that are different from other communities and what some of the challenges are. Because I know you talked before with Shannon and I when we were preparing for this about, where do you begin and where do you stop?
That's a good point. I give no credibility to that study, and I guess question the word integrity after their name. It's solely a sensational grabber, something you'd see on a British tabloid. It draws your attention to the problem, and I guess it doesn't do that job. It's interesting. The dollar value they put on those seawalls for Seawall County were about $1,000 a foot. The number and that leads to about a $5 million. That was about $50 million a mile for Jacksonville. The cost of the Charleston project is $250 million a mile, 50 times greater than what they ascribe to Jacksonville. Now, I don't know where they're coming from. I don't know where they got 632 miles of shoreline. I mean, even with the tributaries, I'm not exactly sure how they could derive such a high number. Maybe they thought Jacksonville ended in Palatka, I don't know. But it brings up the rhetorical question as to where do you begin, where do you end this, and what are your priorities? What are you really trying to protect? Should you really be trying to protect from storm protection or rectifying the drainage problems you have today, which are going to be magnified significantly as sea level rise increases, or just as sea level rise occurs? Areas like San Marco is the canary in the coal mine when it comes to the problems that are coming down the pike. They have flooding now on a recurring basis because of their drainage and because the St. Johns River is higher than it was 30 or 40 years ago when the drainage was designed. What is that area going to do when it increases a half a foot? The drainage or lack of drainage there is going to encumber roadways such as San Marco, Hendricks, the new cancer center that's built there. How are you going to get to it when it's 2 feet of water at the foot of the access from off of 95 when you're trying to get into ND Anderson? Those are the type of problems that if you're going to prioritize all this, the city of Jacksonville needs to be looking at rather than going out and building mega walls along the majority of its shoreline, or even discussing it as a reasonable solution to the most pressing problems at hand. And again, it's all a function of, what's your time frame? Is it 10 years, 50 years, 150 years? Generally, we don't design for 150 years. We generally design normally for the life of a mortgage historically when you're building a building or looking at protection of a building. But that's no longer the case for the sea level rise phenomena that we have now. It is a threat. The local politicians and elected officials need to understand it, and they need to understand the magnitude of it. It's not just a concept. It is a looming threat that's going to cause problems that are going to cost big bucks in the city.
Eric, I want to jump in on that because I think one of the points that you're highlighting is that armoring may be necessary in certain areas and it may not be maybe worth the expense in other areas. I want to talk about when it comes to a seawall, or even maybe the example like this one with a bulkhead, who wins and who loses when you build a wall, because the reality of having a continuous wall, throughout the 632 miles or whatever that they estimated, we know is not possible. So who wins with building a seawall, and then who's losing?
Well, the potential winners would be development downtown, because it has to be a rigorous seawall. The losers are going to be the residential properties because it's going to defeat the entire premise of owning waterfront property. And there are probably better solutions. Some of those may be retreat, some of them may be waterproofing, raising structures, although the structure you have enumerated here probably can't be raised, obviously. But there are better solutions. When you build a seawall, of course, most of this area is already has seawalls. So the die is pretty much cast. It is true, however, that when you build a seawall and you end it, you get end effects and you get erosion on the abutting properties, which actually you can detect in this particular case. This owner at some point in time did not opt for a seawall, or his seawall disappeared. Maybe it was timber created in the 20s and it went away. But there are impacts to properties that are not seawall associated with abutting seawalls. And we have this problem on the coast. I mean, you can look at Ponte Vedra, where you have areas that were seawalled and then eroded adjacent to them, where the dune erosion and the beach erosion was accelerated because there was no seawall, or there was no hardening. So once you go down that road, it's very difficult to come back.
Right. Well, and another thing too, Eric, I mean, we had talked about this also briefly before, is, I guess the seawall really doesn't address the flooding behind the seawall. So, get the water and the rains and the flooding, and of course the gradient of so many of our stormwater systems is not sufficient to drain to the river, especially during a high tide, and also with the storm surge involved. And so that's also something that I thought is interesting. I mean, I think I've heard people call it the bathtub effect. And
that is the pressing problem. If you're going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars, you're probably going to want to resolve those existing issues that affect a large number of existing homeowners and taxpayers. Not a politician, but certainly I would be voting for that in lieu of perhaps spending equivalent amounts of money on development of Lot J. But again, those are political and public decisions. But that's really, those are the type of numbers that are out there where the problems are looming, and where large amounts of money are going to need to be dedicated to resolve the problems, not only that we have now, but that we're going to have in the next few decades as sea level rises. You can't write San Marco off. You can't write off portions of Avondale overnight, Riverside. They all argue for some type of a solution.
Eric, and sorry to the viewers for jumping ahead on my slides. I'll get back to it, but I wanted to allow you to talk about the impacts of drainage with building a seawall. And you had sent me these images of the South Bank to sort of try and highlight this point of drainage and how a seawall can actually impact our current infrastructure, and then of course require updates to future infrastructure.
The problem's pretty simplistic. Water runs downhill unless you pump it, and then you're artificially adding head, and you're moving water without it, because water runs by gravity. As the river rises, the effective drainage and the head difference between the receiving body, which is the St. Johns River, because everything drains to the St. Johns River, the head difference between the river and the grate somewhere inland that's picking up the water and conduiting it down to the river continually diminishes over time as sea level rises. And so therefore the capacity of these pipes, and you see a very large one here entering out of this garage on the South Bank, the ability of those conduits to discharge this water diminishes over time. The result is upland flooding that persists for long periods of time, both from rainwater and also, of course, after major storm events. The water has to get off the upland. Hurricane Irma was the wake up for much of Jacksonville with respect to this phenomenon, and also the vulnerability that we have on the St. Johns River. So yes, the walls do not resolve the drainage issues, and the federal government is not authorized to address your drainage issues. They can only protect you from the impacts of the storm, which is basically to a large degree the waves on top of the surge associated with some storm event. And that's what really the Miami and the Charleston potential experience is heading towards, assuming it's ever funded, because the dollars that you're talking about are pretty dramatic.
I want to jump back to St. Vincent's, and I wanted to ask you what's going on with the bulkhead here that is protecting this critical infrastructure.
Another phenomenon that we discussed it in the AAA meetings is that as sea level rises And depending on the elevation of your seawall or whatever wall you have, such as the wall here in front of St. Vincent's Hospital and St. Catherine's, at some point in time, not only do you have drainage issues, but you have water coming over the wall episodically during the year, just due to astronomical tides. You can see here St. Vincent's is a relatively low wall. Its elevation is about 3.5 feet. What happens is that as the water rises, just the fluctuations in the astronomical tide, which of course varies throughout the month and week and the year, in addition to, irrespective of pumping up to the river having to do with nor'easters, the astronomical tides alone will exceed the cap elevation. And so you'll begin to have water that comes over, not like the storm water to the right, but rather to, as predicted in the curve on the next slide you have. Yeah. This is a series of nomographs that were developed by our firm that basically we used in the AAA to address this phenomenon and try to describe it to the members of the AAA committee. What this says in this particular case is that for a seawall with 4.5, a cap elevation of 4.5 feet, 2 foot of sea level rise, there's going to be 33 times per year that the tidal waters are greater than the elevation of the cap. Now that doesn't include meteorological events. It doesn't include wind waves. It doesn't include boat weight. It doesn't include nor'easters. This is just the astronomical tide. So you can see as sea level rises, many of these areas, such as the walkway and the area seaward of St. Vincent's, will not be usable unless they take some type of remedial action. They raise the area, they raise the cap elevation, they do something. In the vicinity of St. Vincent's, this same data, if you interpret it for a 3.5 foot NAVD cap, again, it's still the 33, and only 1.5 foot of sea level rise, they will have 33 occasions. So we've done this, we've generated these nomographs so that you can look at any seawall or any bulkhead in the city of Jacksonville, in the core of the city and in the historical neighborhoods. This is all based on a tide gauge that exists at South Bank. This is not the ocean tide that we're predicting here. This is the actual data that's been gathered and analyzed and is predicted for the South Bank tide gauge. So these are, again, the type of phenomena that we're going to have in the near future, in addition to the complications of drainage and upland flooding.
You know, before I get to some of the, I guess, kind of bigger questions with what we've been talking about, I want to summarize some sort of key takeaways of what I'm hearing from you when it comes to a seawall, just to make sure that I'm kind of understanding, you know, from the engineer's perspective, what you're saying. When you build a wall, and this is something I've heard you say, that we can't reinforce current walls. We would have to rebuild walls because of how they work and how they would need to get built. So if you are going to rebuild a wall, you have to take the current one down and build a new one. The other thing about a wall is that, you know, its weakest point, right, its lowest point is going to be where the water goes. So if you're going to build a new wall bigger and higher, you have to do it everywhere. Otherwise, the loser is wherever that lowest point is going to be, and that's where the water is going to go. And then the last, I think, big takeaway for me is that we can't wall everything. And so wherever there isn't a wall, those people are now suffering the impacts of sea level rise in order to protect that critical infrastructure that we've decided we want to protect in the wall. I mean, that's kind of really what I'm hearing when it comes to resiliency. And I want to make sure that I, you know, am picking up on that from you and your discussion of some of these points.
Yeah, I think that's all very accurate. And obviously, in many cases, the wall, where do you end the wall? You have to end it, obviously, at higher elevations. If you don't, then you have to circle the area of interest, be it the downtown, waterfront, be it the stadium area, whatever. Where do you end it? And or do we just completely encircle it and take the dike approach as to we have a facility that stays dry within that, and we have pumps and ways of getting the water out of there. But then you run into institutional problems or operational problems. How do you get in and out of it? How do you get to the football stadium? You have to build a massive wall around it to protect it. It's a horse of a different color. So it's not a trivial solution. Some of these solutions, because they are so dramatic, such as Charleston, if you want to resolve it, you're probably dealing with some massive wall, and it is a massive wall. It is a very high wall. So aesthetically, certainly would not be very pleasing. But again, that's a unique situation. And they have a battery, they have the road, and then they have all the residential structures landward of that. So it's easier to incorporate that into the planning and protection for that city or that incorporated area. Where the city of Jacksonville, no, we've got a variety of situations, and our largest vulnerabilities probably are residential. And you are right that if you build a wall of this nature that's supposed to be able to protect you from storm waves and the forces associated with that, that wall has to be much more robust than the existing seawall that someone may have. So typically you can pretty much assume that it needs to be replaced at that location or seaward of that location, which is what they're doing in Charleston. It's all being seaward of the battery.
Before we get to some of the questions that were submitted and open up to the viewers here, what actions do you think probably make the most sense for the city of Jacksonville? And we're not economists, but we know the price tags on some of these walls, and so we know some of the numbers that we're talking about. And where do you see projects that could maybe make a similar impact with a much different price tag?
Well, first and foremost, what the city needs to do, obviously, in addition to continuing to educate its leadership, is to incorporate design standards immediately that require resilience and require an analytical description of the forces associated with that particular development, downtown or redevelopment, new development, such as on the courthouse parcel, the landing. Any new construction needs to meet much more rigorous design criteria. Right now, the criteria that the city of Jacksonville has incorporates or encourages bad design. It basically says all you have to do is build to the elevation of the flood zone that you see on the firm maps from FEMA and add 2 feet to it. That's all you have to do. That's not enough. That doesn't include an update of what the storm surge elevations should be, and they're wrong for most of downtown, and they're certainly wrong for Riverside, Avondale, and San Marcos. We know that from Hurricane Irma. Hurricane Irma was not even a hurricane when it hit here, and it ended up causing a record flood, or at least equivalent to the flooding that we saw in Hurricane Dora in 1964. So it basically was the flood of record, or at least it replicated the flood of record, and it was not even a hurricane. The FEMA elevations don't take into account, and the FEMA protocol and the modeling do not take into account the evaluation of events like Hurricane Irma. And so it defeats the whole purpose of having flood maps for your design criteria. So you need to take into account a reasonable surge. You need to accommodate several feet of sea level rise. You need to look at wave action. You need to look at wave run-up on your particular project to your habitable floor. I think as we discussed at least once or twice, the prototype for this exists. It's the FIS building. FIS several months ago retained our firm to evaluate their design, and they were in design development. They were way down the road in the design of their project to look at it with respect to resiliency, probably based on the results of the AAA committee and some of the public some of the information that was publicized associated with that in the articles in the Florida Times Union. So they retained us to look at their particular design. What we did is we increased their 100-year storm surge by 3 feet. We added 3 feet for sea level rise. We also added elevation to accommodate wave run-up on the upland when it hits the land in front of the new FIS building, and it runs up and goes up towards the building's first floor. By virtue of that, if they had built to the city standards, they could build it plus 6 feet above NAVD elevation, which is our datum. They're now building it at plus 11 feet NAVD as a result of that resiliency study. In addition to that, they're incorporating into the design, probably hidden by landscaping, a second wall. There is no wall in this particular section of shoreline. There is riprap along the shoreline, and then you have the river walk, probably at about an elevation of maybe 6. But in order to preclude wave run-up actually getting to the building, they're going to build into their landscaping, and you probably won't see it by the time it's done, and it's landscaped out of sight, a second wall which will serve to trip wave energy that would have gotten to the building had the waves not broken at that particular point seaward of the building. So they've taken into account all of those design features. They've also put a sill on their glass front, basically a concrete sill above the first floor, so that if water ever does get to the first habitable platform, it doesn't adversely affect glass, which originally was going to run down all the way to the slab. They've now incorporated a curb in there at our suggestion. In addition to that, any passages, and there will be several passages on the seaward side or the river side of that building, will have floodproofing, flood panels. So it's basically the only resilient design that's been incorporated or is being proposed or being constructed on the St. Johns River. But those standards need to be incorporated into the city's code right now, because what the city has is woefully inadequate. And so that could be done in a weekend. Now, I'm not sure how they incorporate it, how they have to adopt it, but the standards are very easy to codify and to put down on paper for every developer or redeveloper, particularly anybody that is using city land or city dollars, has to abide by it. That would be first and foremost. We could do that. That can be done basically overnight, and that's, in my mind, that's the most important thing, because we have these looming projects out there that, if they're not designed correctly, they then become a liability not only for the ownership or the tenants or whoever it's sold to, or the city of Jacksonville. So that would be number one.
Eric, that's interesting, because I feel like, the FIS has realized that it makes economic sense for them to obviously spend a heck of a lot more money than they were planning to spend before to protect their investment. I think that's the thing that a lot of these companies and developers are not really aware of, and we need to do a better job of educating them, is why this is in their best interest, frankly. And it's not onerous regulations and rules. It's actually going to protect their investments in the long term. So I think
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. The design architects and site engineer brought this, right, when people were managing the construction, brought this to the FIS hierarchy. It was a no-brainer. They said, yeah, that makes sense. And, this building's got to be here for 50, 100 years or more. It is, we own it, we're going to use it. And so we need to protect it. And it's a very reasonable cost. And obviously it's well amortized over the life of the building.
Right.
Particularly when you consider potential damage. So, I would suggest that any rational developer on the North Bank or the South Bank needs to meet that criteria, and probably in most cases would welcome that criteria, or knowing that is the criteria they need to meet.
That's great. That's good. Good advice. Well, I think, Shannon, we're ready to go to some questions from our viewers, our guests tonight, correct?
Yeah, we did have some submitted beforehand, but for those that are on live right now, if you want, you're welcome to ask live, or I can jump into some of the questions that were submitted. I will let you decide if you want to do that. Eric, two of the questions that were submitted were really from upriver. And we had a question from the Palaca area and a question from Marion County and our Springs area wanting to know, of all these impacts that you're talking about, sea level rise, armoring, what are the impacts going to be upriver? And then specifically, do you see a connection to our springs?
Well, there will be effects in the river elevation as sea level rises, beginning in the ocean and transmitting down the river just as it does now. It's hard to say what the magnitude of it could be modeled analytically. I can't give anybody a real number that says, okay, well, within the city of Jacksonville, we have 3 feet of sea level rise. In Palaca, you have 1.5 feet. Don't know. We do know, however, that the entire mean water level actually down south is higher than it is in the north part of the river because of the freshwater flood. That's what gives us the freshwater flood. So their mean tide level down there probably is a little bit higher than it is in Jacksonville. And I would expect that there will be a transfer of transition to a higher mean water level during the year, upon which they would have their normal astronomical tides, which are less than obviously up in our area, but nonetheless they do have astronomical tides, and they have wind tides and they have storm tides also. So there will be effects. With respect to the springs, it would not be a positive thing, let's put it that way. That is to say that if the mean water level over a spring increases, then in theory, the discharge of the spring would decrease. But again, whether that's a consequential number is hard to say. And again, that would have to be analyzed and modeled and evaluated by hydrologists. If it's a very robust spring, probably would not be anything that would be quantifiable. If it's a very weak spring, you never know. If the mean water level increases, then that is counterproductive, let's put it that way.
Well, I think too, Eric, one of the things that we have to take into consideration when we're talking about this is it's not just sea level rise, it's also the projections that we may have more intense rainfall events and storms, which will dump more water on the upper portions of the St. Johns River. And we already have seen there's a lot of areas in the middle basin and the upper basin, which means Central Florida and closer to South Florida, where they're prone to flooding and when we have heavy rains already. And so this would only potentially exacerbate that problem. And then we also know how long it takes for the river to essentially drain and all that water out. It can take literally, months sometimes for that water to subside. So if you had, multiple storm events that were greater than normal, rainfall, it could be on top of sea level rise. Could be, it doesn't take much. It's such a flat, low gradient river that just a little bit of sea level rise could make a big difference.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's all counterproductive.
Eric, I want to end today's presentation with what might be a potential future entire topic, but I'm not sure you can answer it. But we had a question about some kind of speed bump on the river's bottom and whether adding speed bumps to the river itself would be something that is either a solution to sea level rise for Jacksonville. And so again, maybe it's a future episode, or maybe it's something you can just talk about real briefly to compare or connect to the seawall issue of what that kind of solution would look like.
Well, I know where that conversation came from. and it's an interesting observation. It derived from the around the effects associated with river deepening. Okay, as was described in your last podcast, I think Nate basically described pretty accurately that when you increase the cross section of the river, you deepen it, you make it more hydraulically efficient, and that's what brings the river downtown. That's why we have much more flow downtown and tidal range today than we had compared to the 1800s. We essentially developed the river as a conduit. The efficiency of that conduit has to do with the friction within the river itself, the bottom, just like the friction of a pipe would have to do with its flow capacity. So the rhetorical point there had to do with a conversation over what to do with all the debris associated with the Hart Expressway that you're taking down. Now we know that the Corps is, when they deepen the river, they make it more hydraulically efficient. Is there some way we could make it hydraulically less efficient so that we could begin to counteract this increase that we know we're going to have, irrespective of sea level rise? We know we're going to have downtown once the harbor deepening project is done. And it's going to be a couple tenths of a foot, which doesn't sound like much, and the federal government says it's not much, particularly when you look at sea level rise. And of course, that's their excuse. But if you live in San Marco, an inch or two of water level rise is going to have a measurable effect on the drainage in San Marco. So the question was, why don't we take all that debris, put it in the river, and add friction to the river somewhere? And rather than taking it to, I'm not sure where it's going. Maybe it's going to Cape Concrete. Maybe they're recycling it. I don't know where it is, but it's a lot of concrete. And that's the same type of material that we actually put offshore for fish habitat. So we know it's inert. We know that basically no harm, no foul. And so the question was raised, or at least the discussion point was raised, well, why don't we put that in the river to begin to counteract some of the effects of harbor deepening itself in order to add some friction to the river? Don't know the answer. I know that you would have to pick the spot. Part of the problem is that the port goes all the way up to downtown. We have Talleyrand, so you would have to pick some efficient spot where it was relatively shallow, let's say, or where the project no longer was dredged, and that would be the type of area where you would add the speed bumps or you would add the friction back in. So there's 2 points to it. Can we add friction, or would this be even just a reasonable place to dispose of this material, even to create fish habitat, if nothing more? So that was the nature of that type of point that you talk over a beer normally.
Shannon, I know you're trying to wrap up. Can we ask this final question real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
You're going to have to be brief, Eric, because we're running out of time. But we had a question submitted. What is the source of the recent acceleration in rising water levels shown? Was that from global warming?
It would, in all probability, it has to be global warming, because the static rise of sea level that we saw for a century was not tied to global warming. Some of the same factors there is basically the static rise of sea level, and it's been going on for a long period of time, or long period, 100 years. That's not really a long period of time as far as geology goes. But in all probability, what we're seeing in these 10, 15, and 20-year evaluations, there's something going on, and this is not normal. And so you would ascribe it to global warming or climate change. Up until last week, I've always had my own doubts with respect to that. But now that I see the data, there is something going on. We've also looked at this in Brevard County, and Palm Beach County, where our clients, same thing's going on. We see the same thing in their tide gauges. So there's something going on here. It's not normal. And the only explanation at this juncture is that it probably is climate related.
Well, I want to thank you, Eric. You were able to sort of segue or tease into a lot of future topics on this and future ideas for solutions to river rising. I do want to promote our episode 3. July 1, 7 p.m., we will be joined by Carl Schross, Director of Conservation, National Recreation and Parks Association, to discuss Can Parks Save Us? So tune into that conversation. With the largest park system in the U.S., is there a way to incorporate resiliency planning and park improvements? We'll discuss how public spaces factor into community resiliency. I want to thank you, Eric Olsen, for joining us, my co-host Jimmy Orth, and everyone that tuned in tonight. If you want to see the recording of this, we'll make it available on our website, and we'll also have registration open for our next episode very soon. So thank you all. Have a good night.
Thanks everyone.